The moment Sandra Bullock stepped onto the red carpet, the room didn't fall silent, but it shifted. Not in an obvious way, not in a way that everyone would notice. But for those paying attention, it was there. A subtle yet undeniable change in energy. Some turned to admire her, recognizing the effortless grace she carried. Others, however, exchanged quiet glances, their expressions laced with amusement. They thought she didn't belong. Draped in a simple beige dress, Sandra didn't shimmer under the event lights like the others. She didn't wear sequins, bold patterns, or statement jewelry. And in a place where extravagance equaled relevance, subtlety was often mistaken for invisibility. She was about to take her seat in the front row, completely unaware that whispers had already started, and even more unaware that someone else was listening. Someone who, in just a few moments, would make sure no one ever dared to mock her again. Sandra settled into her front row seat, crossing one leg over the other with quiet ease. She didn't fidget, didn't glance around for validation. She never had to. But even as she focused on the runway, she felt the weight of judgment pressing in from the side. A few seats away, two models, young, dressed in bold, shimmering designs, leaned toward each other, their conversation masked by the hum of the crowd. "That's Sandra Bullock, isn't it?" one asked, tilting her head slightly, as if to confirm. The other let out a barely concealed laugh. "Yeah, but that dress." Her voice dipped into a whisper, though not low enough to go unheard. Sandra heard. "Beige? At this kind of event?" The first scoffed. "I mean, does she even care how she looks?" The second smirked, eyes gliding over Sandra's effortlessly tailored outfit. "She used to be a star, but now?" She shrugged. "She just looks forgotten." Their laughter was quiet but sharp, slipping through the space between them like needles. Sandra kept her eyes on the empty runway, her expression unreadable. She had been in the industry long enough to recognize cruelty disguised as casual conversation. This wasn't new. It wasn't even creative. She had weathered headlines, gossip columns, and red carpet critics for decades. And yet, something about this moment stung more than it should have. Maybe it was the carelessness in their tone. Maybe it was how easily they dismissed her, as if she no longer mattered. The world had a habit of deciding when a woman's time was up. Still, she didn't react. Not a shift in posture, not a flicker in her gaze. If they were hoping for a response, they wouldn't get one. But what neither of them knew, what they couldn't possibly have anticipated, was that someone else had been listening. Someone whose presence alone could silence an entire room. And in just a few moments, they would regret every word they had just said. Sandra remained still, her expression composed, her hands resting gently in her lap. She had perfected the art of indifference, the ability to seem unbothered even when words cut deep. But beneath the surface, a quiet thought crept in, one she had spent years pushing away. Is this what they see when they look at me now? She had once walked carpets where her presence alone made headlines, where stylists clamored to dress her, where every gaze held admiration. Now she was just another seat in the front row, another face in a sea of newer, younger, louder stars. Hollywood was a machine, relentless, unforgiving. It thrived on what was fresh, what was next. A woman in the industry wasn't allowed to simply exist. She had to prove she still belonged. The fashion world was no different. Trends changed, faces rotated. Relevance had an expiration date, and to some, hers had already passed. She took a slow breath, steadying herself. This wasn't the first time she had been underestimated. She had built a career defying expectations, proving she was more than just a fleeting moment. But tonight, sitting among the unspoken rules of glamour and spectacle, she felt something unfamiliar. A sense of doubt creeping in, as if maybe, just maybe, they were right. Had she become invisible? She pushed the thought away, reminding herself of everything she had accomplished, of every barrier she had broken. She didn't need validation from strangers who didn't know her story. And yet, the words still lingered. She kept her eyes on the runway, pretending not to care. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't yet see, was that she wasn't invisible at all. Because just behind her, someone had heard everything. And in a matter of moments, the night was about to take a turn no one expected. A voice, deep and deliberate, sliced through the air. "What exactly did you find so funny?" The laughter died instantly. The two models froze, their postures stiffening as if the temperature in the room had dropped. Their smiles faltered, their hands instinctively reaching for their designer clutches, as if holding onto something tangible could ground them in the moment. Sandra didn't react immediately. She had heard the voice before, distinct, unmistakable. But she let the silence stretch, absorbing the shift in energy around her before she slowly turned her head. Keanu Reeves sat directly behind them. He wasn't trying to draw attention, and yet all eyes seemed to pull toward him. Dressed in a crisp black suit with an open-collared shirt, he looked effortlessly composed, his expression unreadable. The models exchanged quick glances, their confidence suddenly shaken. They hadn't realized who had been listening. One of them forced a small, nervous laugh. "Oh, we were just talking about fashion." Keanu's gaze remained steady. "No," he said, his voice calm but heavy with meaning. "You weren't." The second model fidgeted, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "It was just a joke," she offered, her voice lighter than before, as if hoping to dismiss the moment. Keanu tilted his head slightly, studying them. "Interesting," he said, his tone as neutral as ever, because it didn't sound like one. The weight of his words hung in the air. The models squirmed under the invisible pressure, suddenly very aware that people were watching. Sandra held her breath for a beat, her fingers resting lightly on the fabric of her dress. She wasn't used to people stepping in for her. For years, she had carried every dismissive remark, every whispered comment, every assumption about her fading importance with quiet acceptance. She had taught herself to ignore it. But Keanu wasn't ignoring it, and neither was anyone else. The murmurs in the room had shifted. The models, once so quick to laugh, now sat awkwardly, their earlier amusement reduced to silence. Sandra finally looked up, meeting Keanu's gaze. He didn't need to say anything more, but in that moment, she understood something. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't standing alone, and neither were they. They were exposed, and the night was far from over. A nervous chuckle escaped one of the models, but it didn't land the way she had hoped. The weight of Keanu's gaze, steady and unblinking, made it clear. This wasn't something she could brush off. It was just small talk, she tried, her voice forced into a casual lilt. "We didn't mean anything by it." Keanu remained unmoved. "Really?" His tone was calm, almost curious. "Because I heard every word." The second model shifted in her seat, suddenly very aware of how many people were now paying attention. Across the front row, glances were exchanged, subtle nods of recognition. Conversations had quieted, eyes had turned. Sandra watched the unraveling with quiet astonishment. For years, she had endured comments like these. Sometimes whispered, sometimes public, but always easy to ignore. She had learned that speaking up often made it worse. It was better to pretend not to hear. But Keanu wasn't pretending. "You weren't talking about fashion," he continued, his voice low but firm. "You were talking about a person." The words hit harder than anything else he could have said. The models sat frozen, expressions unreadable, but their rigid postures betrayed their discomfort. They had been caught, and no clever excuse would rewrite the moment. More guests had turned their heads now. Some leaned slightly forward, sensing the tension, while others exchanged knowing looks. The fashion show continued on stage, but down in the front row, the real spectacle was unfolding. One of the models forced another laugh, short, breathy, unnatural. "Look, we weren't trying to be rude," she said quickly, her voice thinner than before. "We were just making conversation." Keanu's lips curled slightly, though it wasn't a smile. "At someone else's expense," he pointed out. Another pause. This one stretched a little longer. Sandra remained still, absorbing every moment. She wasn't used to seeing someone handle situations like this with such control. No anger, no raised voice, just undeniable truth. One of the models opened her mouth again, as if to salvage what little dignity remained, but Keanu had already shifted his gaze away. As far as he was concerned, the conversation was over, but the damage was done. They weren't the ones whispering anymore. They were the ones being watched, and now they understood what it felt like. The tension still hung in the air, thick and unmoving. The models sat stiffly, their earlier arrogance now reduced to silence. The show carried on, models gliding down the runway in luxurious gowns, but no one in the front row was paying attention to the stage anymore. Then, the sound of heels clicking against the marble floor broke the quiet. Slow, measured, intentional. A woman, poised and regal, stepped forward from the second row. The shift in energy was immediate. People turned, whispers rippling through the crowd as recognition dawned. It was Elise Lauren, one of the most respected names in fashion journalism. A woman whose presence alone could alter reputations. A legend in the industry. She walked straight toward Sandra. The room held its breath. Stopping beside her, Elise studied Sandra for a long moment, then turned her gaze toward the models who had just been put in their place. There was no need for words. The weight of her silence did all the talking. Then, in a voice crisp and deliberate, she finally spoke. True elegance isn't about what you wear. It's about how you wear it. A murmur spread through the audience. The models, who had once mocked Sandra's understated choice, sat frozen, their faces suddenly unreadable. Elise shifted her attention back to Sandra, her expression softer now. "And you, my dear," she said, her voice carrying across the hall, "have always understood that." Sandra didn't move at first. She let the words settle, absorbing their weight. Then, ever so slightly, she smiled. The models shrank further into their seats. Their laughter from earlier had vanished completely, because now the most powerful voices in fashion weren't laughing with them. They were standing against them. This wasn't just about one woman anymore. This was about what true style meant, what it had always meant. And tonight, Sandra wasn't just a guest at the show. She was the moment. The room was still, as if waiting for Sandra to respond. For years, she had let moments like these pass, choosing silence, choosing to ignore, choosing to be the bigger person. Not tonight. She turned slowly, meeting the models' uneasy stares. The same women who had laughed at her just moments ago now sat motionless, their confidence drained. The entire front row was watching. The weight of their own words had finally settled in. Sandra let the pause stretch. Then, with quiet certainty, she spoke. Funny, because it didn't sound like a joke. The effect was instant. The subtle murmur that had lingered in the background vanished. The models shifted uncomfortably, looking anywhere but at her. Keanu didn't move, but something in his expression changed. A flicker of approval, a silent acknowledgement. Sandra didn't need to say more. She had spent years proving herself, justifying her place, adapting to an industry that always demanded more. Tonight, she wasn't seeking approval. She already had it. The shift wasn't just in this room, it was bigger than that. A movement was forming in real time. Across the hall, women exchanged knowing glances. Some nodded. A few even smiled. They had all been where she was, forced to navigate a world that told them their time had passed while refusing to see their worth. But tonight, something changed. Fashion editors whispered to their assistants. Stylists made mental notes. The moment had already left the venue and started spreading beyond these walls. The message was clear. Elegance wasn't about youth, trends, or trying to keep up. It was about presence. And Sandra had never lost hers. The show resumed, but no one saw the models on the runway the same way anymore. The real statement of the night had already been made, and it had nothing to do with couture. Sandra adjusted her posture, smoothing the fabric of her dress. She had come here expecting to watch a fashion show. Instead, she had rewritten the conversation, and the industry would never forget it. By the time Sandra left the venue, the moment had already started spreading. The whispers inside the hall had turned into text messages, tweets, and breaking headlines. Within minutes, social media was ablaze with reactions. Keanu Reeves shuts down fashion snobs at Paris show. Sandra Bullock proves true elegance never fades. One sentence. That's all it took. Clips from the night surfaced online, replayed thousands of times. The models' smug expressions, the instant regret on their faces, Keanu's calm but crushing words, and Sandra's poised response. It was all there, dissected frame by frame. Comments flooded in. This is why Keanu is the best. Sandra Bullock just reminded everyone what real class looks like. The way she handled that? Effortless. Meanwhile, fashion insiders took notice. A few high-profile designers, once obsessed with fleeting trends, began rethinking their messaging. Articles popped up questioning the industry's obsession with youth, its dismissal of women over a certain age. For the first time in years, the conversation wasn't about what Sandra Bullock wore, but what she stood for. Brands that had overlooked her for younger faces suddenly saw her in a different light. A quiet force that didn't demand attention but commanded respect. And Sandra? She didn't need validation from the internet. She had spent decades carving her path, facing criticism, adapting, evolving. But knowing that, for once, the world wasn't laughing at women like her, but standing with them, meant something. As she scrolled through the messages on her phone, one stood out. A text from an unknown number. You never had to prove anything to anyone, but it was beautiful to watch. K. Sandra smiled to herself. Not because of the words, but because for the first time in a long time, she truly believed them. She locked her phone, took a deep breath, and walked forward without looking back. Because true elegance doesn't fade. It endures. Sandra stepped outside, the cool night air brushing against her skin. The echoes of the evening still lingered, but she felt lighter, stronger. Her phone buzzed in her hand. A single message. You never had to prove anything to anyone, but it was beautiful to watch. K. A quiet laugh escaped her lips. She didn't need reassurance, but somehow this felt right. She slipped the phone into her clutch, lifted her chin, and took a step forward. No hesitation, no doubt, because true elegance isn't about demanding attention. It's about leaving an impression that never fades.